very much. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm Jenifer Wakelin. I'm a child psychotherapist. I'm very delighted and honoured to be here today and to have an opportunity to share some thoughts from my work as a child psychotherapist. I'm really thinking about childhood. My key topic really is childhood and epistephilia, the love of knowledge. But as I hope we'll see, there's quite a lot of connections with the themes that John has been illustrating so beautifully, particularly about the development of play, the capacity for play and what the realm of play makes possible and brings alive. So I hope we'll find some creative connections there. It's particularly amazing for me being here, as one of my own earliest childhood memories is of being in Venice at the age of 8 and seeing St. Mark's from across the square, and that's a memory that's never left me. So also some connections to thoughts about memory. So I'm going to offer some observations from work in a mental health service for children in care. So I'm going to be presenting some clinical material, which I'm hoping is not going to be too technical and will raise up some general themes that might serve as themes for discussion later on. So just to say a little bit about my work, there are different kinds of child therapy, and my own training is psychoanalytic. So I'm often interested in the work that I'm doing and how unconscious processes can shape the world that a child is living in. And these same unconscious processes may also shape the thinking of professional networks whose task is to provide some substitute for parenting for children whose families have not been able to keep them safe. So this is a particular area of work that I've been involved in for about over 12 years now. Psychoanalytic child psychotherapy is rooted in the thinking of Freud. So as people probably know, Freud himself did not work with young children, but his observations of his 18-month-old grandson playing were central to a shift in his thinking that led to the elaboration of his later theory of a fundamental dichotomy between the life and death instincts. And this is what I want to illustrate, something about the meaning of these ideas in practice. So it's obviously not the moment to have a lengthy discussion about the developments of Freud's theories, which I'm not an expert on, but just broadly speaking, later in his life, Freud came to think of the life instinct as encompassing sexuality, eroticism, but also something much wider, the wish to combine, the wish to create. So Freud described the life instinct as forming living substance into ever greater unities. So this is this wider idea of the life instinct, which he did carry on calling eros, but it was a broader and wider than sexuality per se. Forming living substance into ever greater unities so that life may be prolonged and brought to higher development. And Melanie Klein, the pioneer of psychoanalysis with children, returned to this idea in her thinking about states of mind that could be more or less integrated. And she said, when the life instinct is in the ascendant, integration and synthesis can successfully progress. So this idea of an instinct that binds and creates ever more complex organization is quite an abstract one, and yet it's one that I find useful in everyday clinical practice. And I'm going to give 2 examples to illustrate this, one from the working of professional groups, and the second from individual work with a child. So for every child who comes into care, there has been a family tragedy or indeed a history of repeated tragedies. And the development of the youngest children who are in the care system, babies and toddlers, may be compromised by many adverse factors, often including fetal exposure to drugs or alcohol, parental violence, and mental health difficulty. Once children are placed in care, the aim is to provide as much continuity for them as possible, above all for the babies, but a stable placement with the same foster care is not always possible to achieve, so further disruptions might compound earlier adversities. So the baby who in this talk I'm calling Aisha, so obviously I've disguised details for confidentiality. The baby I'm going to call Aisha, who was born addicted to heroin, was taken into care at birth. Neither of her parents was able to look after her because of their own substance abuse and severe mental health difficulties. So Aisha was looked after by a group of nurses in a special care baby unit for 3 weeks until she was taken to her first foster placement. And her foster carer was also looking after a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and the foster carer found Aisha's incessant and inconsolable crying more than she could manage. So the crying of babies who are born drug addicted has a particular quality which is very difficult to live with, actually. At the age of 3 months, Aisha was moved to a more experienced foster carer who had no other children in her care and the support of her adult daughter. And at this stage, my service became involved. Concerns about Aisha's developmental needs and about the early disruption in her care galvanized a group of workers around the new foster carer to provide the support so that she could give Aisha her full attention. At the same time, care proceedings were underway to determine Aisha's future care. Regular meetings were held to keep professionals updated of developments, and one of my colleagues visited Aisha and her new foster carer every fortnight, really to observe the baby and her development and the very beginnings of play and her interactions with her foster carer. When Aisha was 5 months old, we received the shocking news that her mother had died by suicide. A month later, her father too died in circumstances that remained unclear. The cohesion of the professional group came under strain under the impact of this double shock. The foster carer and my colleague who was visiting her felt isolated now as their phone calls and emails went unanswered. It seemed that the previously containing and supportive framework that had linked the different professionals together had been shattered. And it took repeated and continued efforts by my colleague to gradually bring the group back together. And one thing that seemed to help in this endeavor was the knowledge from experience in our service of the fragmenting impact of what's been called secondary trauma on professionals whose working lives are in the zone of severe dysfunction, breakdown, and distress, where ordinary parental functioning has been overwhelmed. We know that a particular effort is often required to bring people back together with a focus on the needs and development of the child. And Freud describes the death instinct as aiming to undo connections. And the power of these pressures in organizations to undo connections can't be underestimated. Failures of communication and failures to make links are significant factors in every serious case review and child death inquiry. One of the factors that seemed to help to get the meetings and the communication started again was that my colleague was able to describe developments in Aisha from her observations in the foster home. It was as if a kernel of living growth and development provided a nucleus around which more hopeful and living relationships could reform. So one way of understanding this process is to think of the life instinct helping us to bind and to combine. My colleague went on to work with Aisha and her foster carer for another year until she was adopted by paternal grandparents who lived in another country. They came to stay near the foster home for several weeks so that relationships could be formed before Aisha moved to her new home. And the foster carer and Aisha's family have remained in contact. So these are all connections that we would also see as informed by life instinct, something living that goes on with the belief that these relationships are important. And we know that these much more integrated transitions are tremendously helpful for the young infant rather than a quick move with no connections. So my second example is from individual work with a child in therapy. Psychoanalytic child psychotherapists see children at regular times each week in the same room with the same box of toys. This consistent setting allows close observation of the developing relationship between child and therapist and helps us to come to understand ways of managing anxiety in particular that might impair or block development. Over time, feelings can be noticed and named, defenses can become loosened, and areas of the mind may be freed up for new learning and relationships, and the development of play is central to this opening up. The child I'm calling Serhan was from a Turkish family living in North London. He was a child who created significant concern as soon as he started at school at the age of 5. He seemed to inhabit a world of his own, but his withdrawn states alternated unpredictably with violent rages. He loved drawing and could sometimes listen to a story, but he was completely unable to comply with directions from adults. In the school setting, there were often times when he had to be physically restrained. Sirhan was given a number of different diagnoses by different psychiatrists, including autism and Tourette's syndrome, at different stages of his treatment. Because of the complexity of his difficulties, it was agreed that I'd see him for 4 times a week in a treatment that went on to last for over 3 years. So this is quite an unusually intensive treatment, and one that lasted longer than many therapies now do, particularly with conditions as they are in the NHS. I'll just give a little bit of background, then I'm going to give some clinical illustrations, and I'm going to come back to this theme of the life and the death instincts. Sirhan's mother, Mrs. D, had left her village in Turkey when she was 14 to marry her cousin. She was 18 when Sirhan, who was her second son, was born. They lived with her husband's extended family in North London. We heard in meetings in the clinic that Sirhan's paternal grandfather had dominated the household, hitting the children and verbally bullying the adults. When Sirhan was 2, Mrs. D took the decision to leave her husband and his family, taking her sons with her to a women's refuge. So a very bold step, particularly for a woman in her community. In meetings in the clinic, Mrs. D recalled that even as a 2-year-old, Sirhan had tried to defy his grandfather. And she spoke of there being 2 Sirhans, one who was angry and controlling, another who was gentle and affectionate. That felt like 2 completely different children. At moments, Mrs. D herself came across as bright, lively, and insightful, while at other times she seemed frail, despairing, and at times collapsed. Before the therapy began with Sirhan in our clinic, I observed him in school. At this time, he was 6 years old, and I'm just going to read an excerpt from my notes on this first observation. Pale and dark-haired, with a large nose and protruding ears, Sirhan is concentrating intently on cutting strips of paper. Then he draws and cuts out a figure. Suddenly, he jabs the scissors into the middle of the figure. When I involuntarily lean forward to see better, he reacts immediately, turning to look at me for the first time. His dark eyes are now large and blank, as if a shutter has come down. He returns to the paper strips and meticulously assembles them to make 2 adjoining squares, and then adds 2 more squares below. He sticks the cut-out figure onto the 4 squares and excitedly shows it to the classroom assistant, telling him it's a person in a window. And now I see the figure has one arm raised as if waving. I felt as I watched that the waving figure expressed a kind of greeting that was touching and hopeful. Sirhan's fragility became more apparent, however, at lunchtime after the assistant left him in the crowded hall. He leaned against a wall, grimacing and pawing at a poster of teddy bears until he was rescued by a dinner lady who helped him to join the queue for lunch. Like the school observation, the first therapy sessions with Sirhan were, for me, unforgettable. And here's a brief excerpt from the first session. Sirhan looks in the toy box, which contains toy animals and fences, building blocks, plasticine, drawing materials, and so on, family of wooden dolls, and some small plastic vehicles. Straight away, he finds a helicopter, which has a blade missing, and tells me it's broken. I feel I have failed him horribly, and I say it feels sad to find this broken thing. He then builds an enclosure with the plastic fences and looks at the toy animals while I tell him my name and talk to him about his sessions, which are going to be 4 times a week. He shows me the crocodile's teeth and asks me what the metal pieces in its jaw are for. So actually in our toy boxes, we used to have these wonderful toys made by Britons, which are now no longer being made, but they are wonderful, wonderfully observed small animals, this sort of size, of the whole range of farm and wild animals. And the crocodiles have this jaw that opens with a little handle underneath the jaw, which is quite an appealing toy for quite a lot of children. So Sirhan asks me, what the metal pieces in its jaw are for? And he says, are they ears? And then he says, no, they don't have ears. It's to keep the mouth together. Then he divides the animals into 3 groups, the scary ones, the broken ones, and the 2 small ones. These three groups immediately get all mixed up. He folds a piece of paper in half and cuts out a series of patterns. He holds up two pieces with sharp zigzags and roars, like a wild animal. Then he cuts out some circles and then looks at the inside cutout shapes, folds them in half and makes a quacking noise. He looks at me through the holes in the paper and squeaks, and he tells me this noise is a ball bouncing. So in this first session, I had a powerful impression of a thoughtful child who was looking for meaning. There was a very intense, kaleidoscopic, dreamlike quality in his play, with a strong sense of there being a logic, but one that I couldn't follow. Sorting the animals into groups seemed to be a way of looking for order, but the categories that he'd found were like members of an unstable family, perhaps representing a scary daddy or grandfather, a broken mummy, and a too small child. So we had no session. There were 4 sessions a week. There was no session on Wednesday, so this created what we came to call the Wednesday gap. But in this first week, I had no inkling, really, of the impact that was going to have. So in the Thursday session of the first week, I saw a storm of feeling that brought more of the behavior that had been so difficult to manage in school. Here's a brief extract. Sirhan cuts out a paper bow and arrow in a triangular castle. He tells me the sharp bit of the arrow hits the castle because there's a baddie inside and the castle is broken. Then he tells me about a television program in which the shark eats up all the fish. He moves the scissors around, making loud gnashing sounds. I say I think he's telling me something about yesterday when he didn't have a time here, and this is how he feels about it when he comes back. He bashes the scissors against the toy animals, shrieks, and seems not to hear me. He begins to spin around the room, excited and unreachable. It was very hard for me in this session to feel heard by Sirhan or to say anything to him that made any sense. I was left feeling very bad about myself, as well as confused and apprehensive. Some of these feelings were undoubtedly my own, but some may have been projections from him of unbearable feelings that were extreme and difficult to sort out because he'd been living with them for so long. My experience of not being able to get through to him may have been, in some part, a communication of his experience of having been unable to get through to a young mother who was at times incapacitated by depression. A second unprepared separation came 7 weeks later. Usually very reliable in bringing him to the clinic, Mrs. D told me at the end of the Friday session that she couldn't bring him the next Monday. And this is a brief excerpt from the day after the missed session. Sirhan runs into the room, screams, and turns the box upside down. I say he's angry I didn't give him a safe place yesterday. Why didn't he see me? He jumps on the box and it splinters loudly. I say there are too many bad feelings for Sirhan. I am to have these very scared feelings now. He screams into the toy phone, then bangs the tap and mutters, brain everywhere. And then he goes to the toilet, brandishing the toy crocodile. When he comes back, he fills the sink and tells me with a kind of excited venom, it's water, milk, and wee all mixed. Here I seem to be seeing what the pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott described as an active production of chaos in defense against unthinkable anxiety. It seemed that something that Sirhan had begun to feel was good and reliable, the consistent rhythm of the sessions, had suddenly become the source of painful experience, leaving him feeling that good and bad were hopelessly muddled, like water, milk, and wee, all mixed. The first prepared separation between us came with the Easter holiday break, when I gave him a calendar with squares drawn around the days of the session so that he could see when we were going to stop and when the sessions would resume. Seeing this calendar had a huge impact, but also brought development. And this is an excerpt. Sirhan blocks the door with his chair and bombards me with toys, so he's chucking them straight at me. I tell him to find another way to show me what he's feeling, and he then writes a sign, no, Ms. W, no, 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 no. Then he tells me no is just n and sounds, and laughs emptily. There's a feeling of great bleakness. I say that when it feels like when there's no Sirhan and no Miss W coming together, Sirhan feels he must fall apart like this word, and then there's no words and no talking between us. He puts another sign, dark, by the light switch and switches the light off, saying, I don't need light. And after a while I say, I think he does want to find a light, and he wants to see if I can help him to find it. And then he makes a card with a drawing of himself on one side and a house on the other. He tells me he has 10 windows at home, but some people have 12 or 100, but he's just going to draw 4. I say how horrible it is when he feels that other people have more than he does. And then he draws another figure and tells me this is his ID card. I feel very moved when he shows me the 2 figures. One is large and smiling, one is small and sad, and he says they're both me. Sirhan's insight about himself and about his problem of identity felt extraordinarily poignant, particularly as in the rages that took him over when anxieties became too much for him, he had seemed to completely disappear into an identification with an angry, bullying grandfather. So this next section is called Becoming a Child. Over the next few months, Sirhan became more able to let me know about painful experiences in a way that felt less muddled, more like a younger child. So in one session, this is what he said to me. They're all laughing at you. Your face is dark red, and you're crying, and you've got 0, and you go home and tell your mum, and you and your mum are crying. And then 2 weeks later, he said to me, you will have a dream of being in a tornado and spinning and don't know where you are and very cold and falling in the hole. So I was now the little boy who was able to tolerate some feelings of dependence, who could tell me about painful experiences and frightening nightmares. There was a clearer sense of who is who now, in contrast to the pervasive confusions of the first months. Sirhan was able to persevere for several sessions in writing and illustrating the story of the 3 little pigs. He drew the last pig looking with satisfaction at his strongly built house, saying that was hard work. This was a real achievement because very, very often he'd be halfway through a drawing and then something would take over and it would just be thrown away with rage. So this persistence was something that was hard won, actually. Grasping the idea of work seems so important in contrast to wishful fantasies of being omnipotent that he could get lost in. Sirhan was beginning to come across as a more ordinary boy, but the glimpses we got of life at home were still worrying. He was seen by the clinic's escort wandering across busy roads on his own, collecting pieces of metal in an old supermarket trolley. He was then aged 7. We heard that he went to bed after midnight, suffered from night terrors, and often slept in his mother's bed. A grim period followed in the therapy now, and much of his play felt driven, controlling, and joyless. Sirhan seemed unreachable for some months, and there were many episodes of desperate panic that were difficult to manage in the clinic. When he piled up all the toys and trampled on them, shouting, "The great big muddle heap," he seemed to be under the sway of a drive towards disconnection and disintegration. But in a rare, quieter moment, he told me a story about a mother who was frozen in ice. I was then more able to understand how becoming the scary one might seem the only way out. Gradually, Sirhan seemed to come alive again, helped, it seemed, by curiosity about the world around him. When he wrote a list of the months and the seasons, he asked me, "What are months for?" And then he asked, "What happens in winter? What are roots?" I felt he was in some way telling me about a hope that something had stayed alive underground. And during this period, he also asked me a lot of questions which seemed to be about the nature of reality. Where is infinity? Who comes first, God, Father Christmas, or fairies? And about time as well. Did I do it like this when I was little? And why does time go so fast? Mrs. D, meanwhile, had not been able to learn English as she'd hoped to do. She remained isolated and found it difficult to recognize the extent of her son's needs, so there was some sense in which she was frozen. A referral to social services made with her agreement had not resulted in support for the family. A plan was then made for residential assessment for Sirhan, a child psychiatric unit in South London, which meant that his therapy would come to an end in 5 months' time. During the last phase of the therapy, a new interest and way of being together emerged: snakes and ladders. Drawing his own snakes and ladders board seemed to provide a structured space for Sirhan, the grid with things happening across it, in which anxieties about going to the new place, as he called it, and the ending of his therapy could be explored. Wishes to control the game alternated with curiosity to see what happened next. He often used animals for counters and was now able to observe his own feelings as displaced into them. The tortoise was often his chosen counter, and he gave me a very clear account of what I think his own experience used to be, when he said, when he loses, he thinks the room is going to explode. But now he could describe it. Sometimes Sirhan wanted to speed up the game by throwing several dice at once. Thinking about large numbers seemed to catapult him into a world of millions where he could get lost, but he became more able to come back to the single dice and an idea of moving more steadily, so that we could see and think together about what was happening at each step. As Sirhan became more able to play, there was a new sense of space in the sessions. Ladders and snakes did not get muddled up with each other. He did not try to cheat. Knowing about the structures of time and space makes things more predictable. This allowed him more agency. He now had the capacity to anticipate and to prepare himself for change. This seemed to mean there was a less desperate need to take refuge in omnipotence by identifying with the scary grandfather. In one of our last sessions, during a game in which we both seemed to go round and round, never quite reaching the last square, Sirhan asked me, what is progress? So as I was considering how and whether I could indeed respond, he asked then, what is gravity for? And he answered his own question by telling me, if there was not gravity, people would fall off the earth. So just a few words in conclusion. Child psychotherapists working in the NHS often do not know much about what becomes of our child patients. I heard that after a period in the residential unit, Sirhan moved to a local school for children with special needs, where he became more settled and his needs were better understood. His mother also received support from the new school and became more integrated in the local community. Sirhan's increasing curiosity about his own internal states and about the world around him seem to be aspects of the mental growth that the British psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion describes as depending on truth, as the living organism depends on food. His internal resources, roots, had allowed him to move from an internal world made up of the scary ones, the broken ones, and the too small ones that had quickly collapsed into the great big muddle heap, towards a more integrated, organized, and creative world. A world in which he could be nourished by the love of knowledge, and in which death instinct is mediated by life instinct.